Hi, I'm David Miller, the President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. Welcome to today's Google Hangout, in which we're going to discuss the health and threats to Canada's fresh water with four actually, terrific guests who I'll introduce you to in a moment. So thank you very much for participating. We've got lots of supporters of WWF online and academics and others, and we really appreciate your interest in both our work and I think more importantly the health of Canada's wonderful fresh water. So we're going to share today WWF Canada's latest achievements in fresh water, because in June we had a really important milestone, having assessed the health and threats to 50% of Canada's watersheds, and by 2017 we will have assessed all of our watersheds. Today we're also very proud to be launching our new public online tool for watershed health, which you'll be introduced to in a few minutes. I think it's a fantastic way to look at Canada and its water health as a country and also locally, and you'll learn more about that. So you're going to get some information on the state of freshwater in Canada, a sneak peek at our results and findings. You're going to get the Water Brothers perspective, the famous Water Brothers. That's a capital W and a capital B. And you're also going to get a perspective from a very active organization on the east coast of Canada. I'll be introducing you to our experts, and I've got some questions for them, but you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So we're going to have presentations for about a half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. You can do that in two ways. The first is to open the Q&A box on your Google Hangout page, which is underneath the video, and you can type your question there, or you can email us anytime at live@wwf-canada.org. So remember, if you have questions, and you can send the questions in any time, but they'll be addressed towards the end of the Hangout. Type your question under the Q&A box on your Google Hangout page, or email info@wwf-canada.org. So having said that, I'd now like to turn to our experts. The first is James Snider, who is the acting freshwater vice president of WWF Canada. James has brought his spatial analysis and conservation planning expertise to our work since 2007. But James, you're not just a data and information systems geek. You're known around the office for your canoe trips. Where does this passion for freshwater come from?
Well, David, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to lead canoe trips for a number of summers, 5 summers. Canoe trips in central Ontario and the near north in Ontario as well, places like the French River, Temagami, Algonquin, of course. And having that opportunity to spend each of those summers out there on the river, fishing, paddling, portaging, that really instilled a deep connection with freshwater for me. And is the reason actually I went on to study conservation biology, and is actually why I now work with WWF since 2007.
Well, that's great. Do you manage to keep your canoe vertical while you're going through the rapids, or are you swimming as well as canoeing?
Most of the time. Sometimes you end up with going for a swim. That's not so bad on a hot summer day, though.
No, it would be nice today, actually. Thanks, James. We'll hear some more for you in a few minutes. Next is Sarah Weston, who is the project coordinator for CURA H2O based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Sarah's work focuses on sharing water monitoring and conservation techniques across the Atlantic provinces, and CURA H2O is a funding recipient from our Loblaw Water Fund that's administered by WWF Canada. Sarah, welcome to today's Google Hangout.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
What role can communities play in protecting freshwater?
Stewardship organizations play a really key role in natural resource management, especially over the last decade since our governments have really stepped back from that role. It's very encouraging to work with people who are so dedicated to healthy communities and to sustainable livelihoods. And these kind of community organizations can play a really important role in being first responders to any sort of issues that may arise, and also in driving policy development and regulatory change.
Well, that's great, and we'll have some time in a little bit to talk more about the details of that and how to make that kind of change actually stick and work. But first, I'd like to introduce our third guest, if I can call two people third, and that's Tyler and Alex Mifflin, who are the creators, writers, directors, producers, and most importantly, perhaps, the stars of TVO's Echo Adventure show, The Water Brothers. Tyler and Alex, welcome to today's Google Hangout.
Thanks for having us, David. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for being on. You've been across Canada and also visited many countries to look at water issues. After all of those adventures, what do you find is the most remarkable thing about Canada's fresh water?
Well, I think what makes Canada stand out in terms of water is just our abundance of water, our abundance of clean lakes and rivers in this country. That really does set us apart. But I think what's, we all know that, we have lots of water. A lot of Canadians are told we have lots of water, and I think that plays into some of the challenges we have with connecting people to water in this country. You think if we had so much of it, we'd all be deeply connected and aware of all the threats to our watersheds. But I think that's one of the, because we think we only know that we have so much water, it causes us to be a little bit wasteful with it and not always, use water wisely. And it's just one of the reasons why we're some of the biggest per capita water users in the world. So I think going around the world, it shows you how special our gifts are for water in this country. It gives you a really good perspective by traveling around the world to see how lucky and unique Canada is. But it also shows us how big of a responsibility we have to protect what we do, and the fact that because we have so much water, we have this, we could really be global ambassadors for the protection of water. We could be doing so much better. We do really well in a lot of areas, but I think that we can use this precious gift of having so much water and use it to invigorate the public to really start to care more about our watersheds, because it really is something that should be more part of the Canadian cultural identity. I would say and if we can tap into that, hopefully we can use that to help bring people together to protect this precious gift that we have.
Well, that's very well said, and I think that's one of the reasons that at WWF-Canada we're trying to communicate with people well about water so they understand the real health of it, what the real threats are, and I think Canadians are proud of our potential legacy, but want to make sure that they really do treat our watersheds properly. So in that spirit, maybe we can talk about the health of the fresh water in Canada for a few minutes, because the WWF assessments look at both the health of the watersheds and the threats that affect them. So, Sarah, if I can go back to you, why is freshwater health important, and what is motivating groups like yours and others in Atlantic Canada to take action?
I think that clean water is at the heart of a healthy community, and that we are motivated to protect crucial elements of our communities, such as drinking water, livelihoods such as tourism and fishing, and other species such as salmon. Access to clean water is a basic human right, and it shouldn't be based on economic wealth or cultural structure. For example, it is really crucial that we all work towards ensuring clean drinking water in First Nations communities in Canada.
That's great, and a very important point to remember some of the issues affecting our Aboriginal communities. So, James, if I can turn to you, you've now analyzed 50% of Canada's watersheds. What's the status of fresh water in Canada?
Right. WWF has now been working since 2011, really, to develop a protocol, a methodology, a science-based methodology to report on the health of Canada's watersheds in a consistent way. There are hundreds of organizations and I'm sure thousands of individuals who are working on the freshwater issue right across the country, but including reporting and monitoring at a watershed level, and in some cases at a provincial or territorial level. Excuse me, but that hasn't necessarily been drawn up together into a consistent framework so we can see a national perspective in an accessible way so that Canadians can really get a sense of what is the health of our collective water right across the country. So based on this new methodology that we've put forward that looks at benthic invertebrates, so those bugs that live in the substrate of a river, which are actually very strong indicators of the health of that river system. We look at water quality, chemical contaminants of water, We also look at the amount of water that's found within the river, the flow or hydrology of the river system, as well as fish, the diversity of native fish species within those rivers. And based upon that methodology that's been developed in consultation with scientific experts in both academia and government agencies right across the country, we've put together this method, and the results of which right now we can present 50% of Canada's watersheds. The key result that we have at this point, in fact, is that many of our watersheds do not meet a measure of good ecological condition. So the majority of the watersheds that we've assessed that do get a score, in fact, are fair, so not quite good. There's still some work to be done to ensure that they're in good condition. And a key result, and this is a really important one, is that, in fact, half of the 50% that we've assessed, so a quarter of Canada's watersheds, do not have a sufficient amount of data available to us for us to confidently report a score. And so this relates to both the accessibility and availability of data. What we've been doing is actually drawing upon existing monitoring programs for things like water quality, for things like fish, right across the country, bringing together all of those data sets and compiling them. And what we've seen is that in many places, those data, that monitoring initiative, hasn't been enough for us to confidently report a score. And so that's a very key finding of our work today.
I think I'll come back to that point later, but it's a very important one. So I think it would be great maybe to talk about the threats for a few minutes. James had just spoken about the health. So significant number of watersheds are fair, our goal is good. Significant number of watersheds, the data isn't there to really make an assessment. Maybe Tyler and Alex, can you talk about the threats that you've seen? What are some of the most significant threats to rivers and lakes that you've seen through your work in producing your show?
Well, I think probably one of the biggest threats we've seen to the health of freshwater rivers and lakes ecosystem is probably climate change and pollution. Whether it's and with pollution, there's so many different aspects you could talk about. One issue we looked a lot is plastic pollution, and obviously that's a bigger problem when your watershed's close to big municipality, like where we live in Toronto and like Ontario. There's also things like nutrient pollution, eutrophication. So, Lake Erie is a perfect example of where you have huge algae blooms from nutrient pollution, and they can lead to things called dead zones, where there's basically so little oxygen in the water that almost nothing can survive in it. That's definitely a big problem in Canadian waters.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think when we're looking at water use and water quality, we have to look at the biggest water users. So agriculture being, using about 60, almost 70% of the water. All water use in Canada is from agriculture. So, if you're using fertilizers in an improper way, that can lead to things like dead zones. So, yeah, pollution coming from industry, from agriculture. And I think another big threat, obviously climate change because it connects to everything, but for Canada specifically is transparency and sort of, I think there's been some erosion of the federal protection and sort of freshwater in this country, and I think the muzzling of scientists, making sure data is available, those are all big threats, especially as a lot of industrial development coming in the next say decade or two in Canada is going to be happening in the north, in places where not a lot of people live. So I think that's another big threat in a way, is when we have a lot of industrial development that could lead to water pollution in places where not a lot of Canadians live. It means that sometimes people can't always, there's not enough voices to be heard about those threats. So that's why things like this watershed report are excellent, and that we're really excited about, because we need more Canadians aware of what the threats even are. I think the fact that that one of the big threats is the fact that many people in Canada don't understand that there are big threats to our watersheds in this country, and so I think that's something that like I said, this watershed report hopefully will help a lot with, is just a public awareness and engagement, because that is a threat in and of itself.
Well, thank you for the shout out, and but I've got one follow-up question. Can you just talk a bit more, it could be either of you, about why climate change is a serious threat to water? Because not everybody might be aware of the links.
Yeah, well, I think it's just from so many different angles, and I think what makes it such a big threat is because there's so many unknowns and there's so many variables, and we don't really know what's going to happen. But we know that through climate change, we can have things like reduced snowpack, and also shorter winters. More rain falling, but maybe on less days, or areas that are hot getting hotter and drier, and wet areas getting wetter and wetter. So yeah, the loss of snowpack can have a big impact on rivers, how much water is in rivers, the loss of glaciers. We're even seeing in British Columbia right now drought warnings, things that Canadians might not think happen in this country or should be happening. In British Columbia, the prospect of an actual severe drought, you would never think about that happening, but that's something that sort of a new reality for Canada is with climate change. And then with climate change, there's some of these sort of more obscure connections back to fresh water. So say ocean acidification. We know that carbon dioxide builds up in the ocean. And that can affect things like pteropods, which are small shelled creatures. And the main food source, are one of the big predators of pteropods in British Columbia waters, are pink salmon. So if ocean acidification were to reduce the amount of pteropods in the ocean, how would that impact salmon? And we know salmon are critical for the health of rivers throughout the Pacific Northwest. So that's like sort of one of these sort of more obscure threats through climate change to our watersheds that you could actually, because of how climate change impacts the ocean, that impacts salmon, which then impacts the health of the entire watersheds throughout the Pacific Northwest. So that's in a nutshell, one of the many ways that climate change can have these sort of unintended consequences for the health of our freshwater ecosystems.
And another thing I would add is also just for cities too, as well as I was saying, we're going to experience more floods, more droughts. One thing is our infrastructure is a really big part that's contributing to, the lack or poor infrastructure we have is contributing to pollution going into the Great Lakes. So that's another area that's definitely contributing.
Yeah, like combined sewers and stormwater running off, more pollution entering our lakes and rivers close to major cities because we've sort of ignored our water infrastructure in this country. That's another big problem, and it's sort of at our own, to our own cost. Like it's just going to come back to bite us if we ignore things like water infrastructure. So I think this is a really important time for Canadians because, especially with infrastructure, because we can design a whole new type of water infrastructure for the 21st century that can reduce the things that are going into our lakes, like finding ways to treat pharmaceuticals before they end up in our watersheds, plastics, ending the use of microplastics in consumer products. So it just goes on and on. There's so many threats to talk about, but yeah, water infrastructure and its connection to climate change is another one for sure.
Well, it's great background for turning to James, because my next question is for James, but I just do have to say, the idea is pretty sobering that in a province full of temperate rainforests that we're being threatened with droughts. That really tells you that something's amiss at the moment. So, James, can you talk about what we've done so far in terms of assessing these threats? Tyler and Alex have talked a fair bit about different kinds of threats, and I know we've assessed about half the watersheds in Canada. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Alex and Tyler did an excellent job in terms of introducing some of the threats that we've actually looked at within our assessment. We've identified 7 categories of threat that are relevant in terms of changes in biodiversity or impacts on aquatic ecosystems. And again, that's been through a science-based exercise in consultation with science academia and agencies across the country to really see globally what are those impacts, what are those major threats to aquatic ecosystems. We've identified 7 categories of threat, things like habitat loss, so the direct conversion of native vegetation or habitat into cultivated lands or urban areas, loss of forest canopy. Habitat loss is known as to be the #1 driver of biodiversity loss globally, whether it be terrestrial or in freshwater ecosystems. A second, looking at habitat fragmentation, so the role of in-stream infrastructure, including dams, which can be a major issue in terms of dispersal of things like fish species, the ability of salmon to move upstream to spawn, to move back downstream to move out into our oceans. And so those in-stream infrastructure can be an impediment for the movement of many species, as well as issues around roads and rail. In some cases, we have crossings of roads or rail with streams or rivers. In some cases, we have infrastructure like culverts, and those can be an effective way for species to move, but in other cases, those actually can be perched, meaning that they are elevated above the body of water that we're interested in. And so that actually can become an impediment or an obstacle for fish species or other aquatic species to move up and downstream. So further, we've looked at pollution, a big one, as you might guess, looking at point source pollutants. So actually the National Pollutant Release Inventory, which is required reporting through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So large industrial emitters of pollutants into land and water actually report back releases of a broad suite of parameters, chemicals, in terms of the amount that are brought into our rivers each year. So we've looked at that, as well as the risk of agricultural contamination due to pesticides, nitrogen, phosphorus. We've also looked at the risk of pipeline incidents, so spills that occur through pipelines, as well as road and rail incidents where more dangerous goods are spilled through an accident on our roads or highways. Finally, we've looked at, of course, invasive species. This is a key threat, an emerging threat many of us have known about for the last 20 years or so, which are those species that are introduced beyond their native range and can have significant impacts on native biodiversity through changes in energy, through the food web, or just outcompeting other native species. So it can be a major driver of biodiversity loss. And finally, climate change. Looking at observed climate change for key aquatic events, looking at increasing winter temperature, which impacts snowmelt, or snowpack rather, and the corresponding melt. So as a whole, all of those 7 categories of threat we've assessed right across the country. And the key finding that we have is that many of our watersheds already do have comparatively high degree of stress. We've identified the South Saskatchewan River and watershed, as well as the Great Lakes watersheds, as having a very high threat overall. And some key factors there are, of course, looking at pollution. Pollution is a key issue for us, as well as this fragmentation issue, that we're having a lack of connectivity between our rivers and lakes and the surrounding watersheds. So that's a pretty good overview of our methodology and some key results.
Well, maybe, James, I can ask you to build on that by demonstrating the results of the threats assessment. But just before you do, I just want to remind people, you're on a WWF Canada Google Hangout. I'm David Miller, the President and CEO of WWF Canada. We're talking about freshwater today. And if you want to ask some questions, you can send them in anytime by opening the Q&A box on your Google Hangout page. We're getting questions already from people. We welcome them. We'll be answering them in a few minutes, or emailing live at wwf-canada.org. We're joined by James Snider, our Vice President Freshwater, Sarah Weston, the Project Coordinator for CURA H2O, and Tyler and Alex Mifflin, the Water Brothers. James, back to you.
Thank you, David. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to present this live new website or online platform, Watershed Reports. For those joining us today, they can actually view it online now. It's watershedreports.wwf.ca. And really, this website is intended to be an interactive tool to raise awareness around freshwater issues in Canada and help build an ethic towards stewarding these invaluable resources that we have here in Canada. As Tyler and Alex alluded to, we really are blessed with a huge abundance of fresh water in this nation. You'll have heard this many times before, potentially, that Canada has as much as 1/5 of the world's fresh water. And so there are thousands of lakes and rivers right across the country, as you can see here. What many people do not know is that there are roughly 25 watersheds. So this idea of a watershed was really important in terms of making that connection between that abundance and wealth of fresh water that we have and our activities on land, and the impacts that those activities can have on aquatic ecosystems. what WWF has done is actually complete assessments, and what we will do is by 2017 have completed assessments of the health and threats for each one of these 25 major watersheds right across the country that are delineated here in white. As of today, we can report on results through this new interactive web platform for half of those watersheds, so 12 of the 25 watersheds right across the country. And so there's two ways to navigate the site. And I should also note there is a French version of the site for those of us joining us who would prefer to see the site in French language. So please do click on that, and the site is entirely in French there as well. But coming back to navigation, we should note that we also want to have a sense of Canada across the country. So what is this narrative? Bringing up all this information, and this has been WWF's key objective, is working with organizations right across the country to bring together this information in a consistent narrative right across our nation. So what you're looking at here is a map of the overall threat for 50% of Canada's watersheds. The colors ranging from dark red being a very high threat score to a dark green being no threat, and then two additional sort of grayscales being data deficient or partially assessed. I'll come back to that in a second. We can also have a view of health across the country, and you can switch over in terms of the two tabs at the bottom of the page. Alongside the map view is really an important part of the content of this site, which is the discussion of the results, and also a portrayal of this overall threats assessment. So right now, we can see that there are 2 watersheds of the 12 that we've assessed that came out as very high threat overall. And those are the South Saskatchewan here and the Great Lakes watersheds you see here in Southern Ontario. There are 4 other watersheds that have high scores overall for threat, but we can also begin to unpack this and begin to look at individual threats. So for pollution, which I mentioned is one that we've identified as being a high threat overall, right now we see here, in fact, very high threat scores for as many of 6 of the watersheds that we've assessed to date. So this is definitely a concern for us, whether it's point source pollutants or non-point source pollutants from agriculture or other sources. This is certainly an issue that we should begin to be looking to mitigate and reduce and diminish in terms of its impact on aquatic ecosystems. Similarly, we can look at habitat fragmentation, and we see here in southern Canada, this is certainly a factor in many of our watersheds in terms of the overall threat. That said, we also know that the water issues are inherently a local issue. So you can also navigate the site at a local level. So I've given you a sense of some of the national level results, but there is an ability of the website to actually use a geolocation function. So like as you would on your phone, I'm just going to click here, and it actually, given that I'm in Toronto, Midtown Toronto, it's shown me that which watershed I live in. And that's a really important point, in that many Canadians do not know their watershed. And that really is a critical step for this site, is making that connection that we each live in a watershed, one of these 25 major watersheds, and that as we grow in terms of our awareness around the issues that are important to the aquatic ecosystems in this country, then we can better steward those resources to make sure that they are available to us to use and to enjoy in the future. So one example here is of the Great Lakes, and this is new in terms of our assessment, even for health and threat. We have found that the Great Lakes watersheds, so these are the rivers that drain into the Great Lakes, our assessment overall has found that this area is comparatively very high threat. We can zoom in even further if you'd like to look at Lake Ontario, the surrounding watershed that drains into Lake Ontario. It includes the Don River, the Rouge River, and so on. Or we can move over into Lake Erie sub-watershed. And you'll see here we have results at the sub-watershed scale for both our threats assessment as well as the health assessment if I click over on that next tab. So I alluded to earlier this question of data availability and data sufficiency. And that's a really key result for us right now, including for the Great Lakes. As a whole, for this watershed, the rivers of the Great Lakes as a whole are reported as data deficient. You'll see that here in terms of their health scores. We were able to generate or compile a sufficient amount of data for water quality and for benthic invertebrates, within Lake Erie, within Lake Ontario, those two watersheds, as well as the Eastern Georgian Bay watershed. But as you move northwards, we were not able to gain access to the necessary data to confidently report a score. So as a whole within this region, we come back with the score of data deficient, meaning that we cannot confidently assign a score for this region. And so that's a really important finding. Some other factors I'd like to just quickly point out here. If you'd like to learn more about our assessments, the science behind our assessments, there's what I find to be a very useful infographic. What is a watershed? The idea of these nested watersheds and how rivers are connected through land. How each of those major threats that I've spoken about can actually relate to watershed health. And for those of you who really want to know all of the nitty-gritty detail, I should note that each one of our assessments has all of the statistics and maps and figures underlying this assessment within our watershed reports, and that's a PDF that you can download. Our methodology is further described here if you'd like to learn about each of our indicators, the algorithms that we use, and importantly, in terms of transparency, all of the data sources, those agencies and organizations that have provided data to us, that have provided feedback in terms of the assessments that we completed. And there is a whole host of agencies and organizations right across the country that have made this work possible. I should also note there are a suite of donors. These people have made the freshwater health assessments and threats assessment and this new web portal possible. Without their support, this site really wouldn't exist and this work wouldn't exist. So we, of course, would like to thank them for their support, and I encourage you to please check out this page to find out more behind the supporters of our work. Finally, the key step beyond education and awareness is taking action. So moving from finding out what is my watershed, well, I happen to live in the Lake Ontario watershed, and that I find that this is an area of comparatively high threat. But what can I do about that? That's a critical step. And one thing that I would point out here is actually what we call our Loblaw water funds. These are on-the-ground restoration and monitoring projects that are actually made possible through the partial proceeds of Loblaw's plastic bag fees. So when you forget your reusable bag and you have to pay 5 cents, I think it is, those funds actually go towards on-the-ground restoration and monitoring projects. WWF has been able to grant as many as 10 projects last year and 14 this year. And these are projects that help us either fill in those data gaps where we have found that scores are data deficient, or in other cases, direct restoration, habitat restoration projects. So I'd encourage those people on the line today who would like to get involved to please do check out the Loblaw Water Fund projects here and learn more about opportunities to get involved for volunteering to take that direct action.
Well, that's great, James. Thanks very much, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about the details of our website, but I encourage people to use it themselves, and if you have questions, send them in using the Q&A tab on the Google Hangout or email info@wwf-canada.org. James's last point was about the Loblaw Water Fund. We do have a grantee online with us, which of course is Sarah. And I wanted to ask you, Sarah, how's your work influenced by our new tool and our assessments? And what are your goals for watersheds in Atlantic Canada? And maybe you can talk a bit about what you've been doing as a result of the Loblaw Water Fund grant.
Sure. These tools from WWF are really invaluable in providing overall motivation for the work that we're doing here in Atlantic Canada. We're coordinating water quality monitoring on a regional scale that feeds into a central database. And so before this project, there's a lot of stewardship organizations doing a lot of work, but if everyone is using different methods and different equipment, it's really hard to harness analysis of that data to apply it to restoration projects and policy development and that sort of thing. These projects from the WWF are providing crucial, much-needed leadership in moving towards common goals in water management, freshwater management in Canada. The Loblaw Water Fund is really important tool in bridging the gap in terms of funding, whereas the governments are sort of stepping away from this responsibility, as I mentioned, and there's a lot of civil society organizations rising up to take this place and to protect our watersheds. But in terms of funding that activity, there's a gap there that is hopefully being addressed over time. And so the Loblaw Water Fund is really valuable in helping to support this work on the ground. So it's been instrumental in the monitoring equipment that we've provided to our network of partners across the region, so that we can ensure that all of the data that are coming in are of scientific value enough to work on restoration projects and work with governments and organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund. We provide a lot of training workshops, so skills and capacity buildings with these organizations so that they are working at the capacity equal to professionals, so that we can use the outcomes of the project. And most recently, we've been working on a report card template. So we've been harnessing all of this data and feeding it into a central database and working on connecting all scales of governance and management from the communities that are our partners, not only in Atlantic Canada, but emerging across Canada as well. And yeah, the report card template can help us to summarize this data. So there's a lot of different report card templates out there, and we would like to, we're working on a very standardized template that will be accessible to everybody and can feed right into the tools that James is talking about.
Sarah, I love that connection between science and scientists and science-driven community activists, and making sure that data, when it's collected by citizen scientists, is done in a proper professional way so it's useful. I thought that was a really important point. And the template, so we can all work from the same kind of principles, sounds like fantastic work. So thank you for your leadership there through CURA H2O. I've got one more question for our guests, and then there's lots of questions here from people who are online. So my question is for James. Can you share WWF Canada's goal for water in Canada and what we'll be doing over the next 5 years to get there?
Yep. We have a really ambitious goal ahead of us, and that is by 2025, we envision all waters in Canada to be in good ecological condition. And so the health assessments that you've seen today provide that baseline so that we can evaluate our progress towards that ultimate goal. We hope that's also a shared goal, a shared vision that many other organizations and governments ideally as well can see as something that we can work together collectively to achieve in terms of stewarding our fresh water. That really is, it's a big undertaking. It's no small task. In the next 2 years, we'll be finishing our freshwater health assessments and threats assessment for each one of those 25 watersheds. So by 2017, this web platform, watershedreports.wf.ca, will have each one of those assessments available to you online. And from there, I'd speak to, WWF has 3 priority regions where we're working on the ground in terms of freshwater specifically. And so that includes, I'd like to use this map I have behind me, but I'd probably confuse myself if I tried. That includes the Skeena River on BC's coast, working in the estuary there around cumulative effects, as well as on the east coast in the St. John River watershed, looking to secure a healthy and resilient St. John River, looking at adaptation planning and so on within that region, and hydropower development, as well as within the St. Lawrence River. So all told, these science-based assessments of health and threat are intended to be the basis for an evidence-based decision-making framework that can allow us to actually begin to prioritize appropriate action. So what is the most bang for your buck, let's say, in terms of trying to achieve healthy aquatic ecosystems and watersheds right across the country? And we hope that resource is a tool that many other organizations can use as well in terms of moving towards that shared vision of all waters in good condition by 2025, excuse me.
Well, it's an ambitious goal, and it obviously can't be accomplished without, all Canadians coming together. But people do need to know the data and the facts and have some leadership. And James, thank you for providing that leadership and very rigorous scientific work on behalf of WWF Canada. Those are our presentations for the purposes of this broadcast today. So we've now got a few minutes for questions. To remind you, if you haven't got your questions in yet, feel free to submit them through the Q&A box on your Google Hangout window, or email us at live@wwfcanada.org. The first question I'm going to ask of Alex and Tyler, mostly for rotation purposes, because we just heard from James and Sarah, and it's from Damien. What is being done to stop the draining of the Great Lakes watershed through their aquifers? So I think what Damon's getting at is are there any public policy initiatives you're aware of to deal with overuse of water through their aquifers? And maybe, well, why don't Tyler and I give a go at that, and James, if you know if we've identified that as a threat or not, that might be part of the answer too.
Well, I'm not aware of any of the actual policies that are dealing with that specifically, but we could talk about a couple examples that we've encountered through different episodes that we've shot. One of them is, and it actually speaks to sort of the importance of community involvement and community organizations in sort of in getting people engaged, and that was in and around Guelph. There's a group called the Wellington Water Watchers that we worked with on one of our episodes related to bottled water, stopping the draining of an aquifer for the use of bottled water. And they weren't just targeting the bottled water companies. It was also working with farmers and working with other water users, people in industry, to come up with a responsible management plan for aquifers. But just in general, the management of aquifers is definitely a big concern, especially with climate change. You know, when surface water becomes scarce, we turn to our groundwater and aquifers to bump up, you know, the supply, and that's becoming a big concern all around the world. Globally, it's you know, places like India, China, California. We're seeing rapid groundwater loss, and that could have spillover effects on dry. And why it's important to know more about aquifers, because we know so little about them. You know, we know that it's very difficult to know how big aquifers are. So, and even for the Great Lakes example, it's very difficult to know how big some of these aquifers are. All we can really do is measure how fast they're being depleted, and all the signs point to, you know, major aquifers being depleted much faster than their rate of renewal. But for the case of the Great Lakes, we had just encountered one around the city of Guelph, which was stopping, you know, the unsustainable drawing of groundwater, and that was connected to a group called the Wellington Water Watchers. But I'm not aware of the actual policy and what's being done. Maybe James would be able to answer that question if there is any specific policy you wanted to talk about.
Anything to add there, James?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Groundwater really is a very difficult issue to deal with, in that it's hidden. Surface water is hard enough, and we see it right there. But knowing what's occurring in our aquifers is a real challenge, but it is super important. Of course, being a source for drinking water for many people. There was a global analysis recently, I think two weeks ago, that actually identified globally those watersheds around the world that are at risk due to groundwater depletion. And that did include some watersheds here in Canada. I don't recall if the Great Lakes were one of them, but it certainly is an issue that we are mindful of. You can't simply just manage groundwater in of itself. It needs to be part of a more integrated approach. And I think that's a really important provision in terms of those ongoing dialogues both in Ontario and Quebec, as well as at the federal level through the Plan 2014 exercise through the International Joint Commission, looking to manage water resources within Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. And so I'd expect that plan, if it were to be approved, would have provisions related to groundwater as well as surface water provisions in terms of the amount of water that's there. And finally, just as an aside, knowing how much water is within our aquifers is really a critical piece. And we've shown in many different places right across the country that we do not know those resources well at all. They are not mapped, they are not monitored, and not in a consistent and comprehensive way at all.
That's great. Thanks, guys, for that answer, and I hope, Damien, that helps a bit. Next question, and by the way, the questions are flowing in. We're using low technology to transmit them to me. There we are. But they're flowing in. So thank you very much. If you got any more, we'll take them for a couple more minutes at the Q&A box or info@WWF-Canada.org. So from Michelle, and Sarah, I'm going to ask this to you. How can we mobilize the average Canadian to realize there is a problem with the health of our water?
That's a very good question, and we've been having a lot of conversations together about that in Atlantic Canada. I think one way is certainly to make that connection that was mentioned earlier between the culture identity of Canadians and also how it affects our day-to-day lives, our community health, as I mentioned earlier. When it's close to home or when it's in your own backyard, there's not really the ability to have a disconnection with that issue. So, I mean, certainly the work of a lot of the stewardship partners that we work with have really strong community engagement programs. Working with elementary schools, we have some programs out here called, Fish Friends or River Rangers, so that it makes a connection from a really young age that, like, let's say in an urban area, a local river isn't a place to dump shopping carts or that sort of thing. It's a living ecosystem, and if you raised the salmon hatchlings that are in that river, you tend to care a little bit more about the health of that ecosystem. So community engagement through education is definitely one way. Keeping any issues as public as they can be on the radar so that they reach sort of the average person out there. So events, cleanups, volunteer events. Yeah, so I think, again, stewardship organizations do have a really strong role to play, and we need to make these same connections with our politicians as well, so that our policy and our day-to-day activities include preserving, the health of our watersheds and drinking water as well.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks so much, and you speak from knowledge working on the ground, so I think that's a great answer. I'm going to ask the next two, one from Claire and one from Alex, to James, because they're related. The first is, this is from Claire, you mentioned availability of data. Were you able to access monitoring and water quality data from Environment Canada, ACBIS, and the province of Manitoba, for example, or Freshwater Institute, Department of Fisheries and Oceans? That's from Claire. And then from Alex, are there some examples of where better access to water data via WWF initiatives has enabled and or empowered people and or organizations to take action to protect Canadian waters? James.
Yeah, very good. So to the first question in terms of data availability and accessibility, we have been able to get access to some federal data sets through Environment Canada, some of the long-term monitoring programs, including in the lower Athabasca region through the Joint All Signs Monitoring Program there. That said, there are, I'm sure, sources of data within the federal government right now that we have not been able to gain access to, including some of those that you have listed within your initial question. To the second question, it's a really, you're bang on with the exact rationale as to why we've completed this work. And that is to make this tool available so that other organizations right across the country can begin to put this into application to make progress around policy or watershed management. We have seen such examples, including on the Ottawa River, working with the Ottawa Riverkeeper there. The results of our data deficient scores within the Ottawa River have certainly been a key finding in terms of identifying priority actions within that watershed, which includes identifying where additional monitoring should occur. But that's the exact type of rationale that we are trying to pursue in terms of having completed this work, is to provide those tools, that evidence basis for us to, and other organizations to actually point to individual issues and prioritize policy and management prescriptions based on that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask the next question to Tyler and Alex, just for sake of rotation and fun. So the next question is, how are you enabling decision makers, including elected officials and senior staff, at different jurisdictional scales to use this information in their planning and decision-making processes. So I'll ask James the technical part of that, but maybe you guys can speak to collectively, through your program, through the work of groups like CURA H2O and organizations like ours, how do you think that's affecting decision makers and enabling them, both at a political level and a civil service level, to make smart and good decisions about water?
Is this in reference to the report, or is this just in general, how do we engage decision makers?
The question was about the report, but I'm asking of you more broadly because you engage people through your show. So I'd just be interested in your perspective of how you engage decision makers in a persuasive, effective way.
Well, for a couple episodes, we've worked with decision makers, mostly in the Ontario government. One in relation to Asian carp, which is invasive species, connected to the problem of invasive species, especially as it relates to the Great Lakes. And we definitely had a lot of success engaging people in government, just making them aware of the problem. I think we were able to do that because we were able to take the topic of invasive species and make it fun and engaging for a wide audience, and just make it into more entertainment. But you can't always do that with a lot of different water issues. That's something we really try and do, is just try and find ways to take a serious subject matter and make it entertaining, so that entertainment can engage a wide audience. But otherwise, another way that we've engaged with decision makers is actually through schools and mobilizing a lot of youth. We do a lot of speaking engagements at schools, and we've through some of that work, we've worked with the Ontario government as well. Just been able to speak to, because of some of that work, being able to speak to people like Glenn Murray, who's the Ontario Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So it's just, and we did that by bringing together a bunch of youth on Earth Day and helping to do that. So I mean, there's a couple different episodes where we've been able to really reach decision makers, but hopefully, I mean, just our episodes are able to speak for themselves, and by able to, to take complex subject matter, like can happen a lot with water issues, and boil it down into something that's simple and accessible for as wide an audience as possible. Because I think that's always a challenge, and I think that's always a challenge for I'm sure people like James and scientists as well, is just science communication. I think sometimes scientists maybe aren't the best communicators, so it takes different people, people in media or in every sector of society to be aware of these issues. So
yeah, I think that's what it boils down to, is if you have an informed electorate, if the people, your constituents are aware and engaged in an issue, the politician should be aware and engaged in that issue as well. So I think it's just a question of raising awareness among all Canadians and showing Canadians how we're all connected to water. And then once you sort of have that instilled in people, I think the political will and sort of the decision makers, it's going to have to reach them, and they're going to have to start making decisions based off what most Canadians want to see happen, which is, well, I hope all Canadians want to see happen, is we have healthy watersheds, and hopefully by 2025.
So, Sarah, do you have any comments on that issue of engaging decision makers?
There are a lot of different ways to do it. I would definitely sort of reiterate or agree with everything that was just said. In some cases, we work mostly directly with our governments in terms of through the universities and being able to have direct meetings and talking about management. In many ways, community-based management is becoming an irresistible opportunity, in that a decentralized management system is, I believe, about 10 times more effective economically than if the governments are trying to manage our natural resources themselves. And so by engaging communities in resource management, we are increasing scientific literacy among the public, which kind of goes full circle to everything that was just said, in that once there's a general understanding out there and a connection with what's happening, then it mobilizes action directly and indirectly.
Great. Well, thanks for those perspectives. And a lot of it does come down to an engaged, informed citizenry, and I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do at WWF, is make sure people really know what's going on, where the health issues are, where the threats are, and where we need data and simply need to know the facts. So I've got a whole bunch of questions here. We won't be able to deal with all of them. I'm going to ask a couple to James at once. The first is, how can this tool be used to inform the conversation and highlight some of the good practices that are happening to address freshwater impacts? For example, green infrastructure in the urban realm to address stormwater pollution and pollutants and CSOs. That's the first one, James. And the second one is, well, they're related. There's two that are related here. It's the second one. One of the major issues in the Red River Basin is the major source of phosphorus is from the U.S. U.S. and Canada have been working to show issues don't stop at the border. Will we be collecting any U.S. data? That's from Claire. And then Susanna notes that Arizona seems to have mapped the aquifers and know their volumes and capacity. How come we don't have that ability in Canada? So maybe that's three questions instead of two, and you've got about 2 minutes, James. So.
Well, I normally do talk pretty quickly, so I'll see what I can do in terms of managing 3 in 2 minutes. The first one, yeah, this is an excellent question, and one factor that I didn't really present in much detail today is that for each one of our assessments, including for water quality, where the data is available, we actually try to do a trend analysis over time. And in some cases, we actually have seen increasing trends in terms of the health of some of our metrics, which is really an important finding. And that actually includes some of the watersheds within the Great Lakes region. So in that case, where we're actually seeing improvements in those metrics over time, that actually demonstrates clearly the role of stewardship and action through many actors, whether it's the conservation authorities or the various government agencies within that region, in terms of their concerted effort to try to push the yardstick, let's say. And so that can be shown out over years of monitoring, that action can have impact and can be observed. And so for some variables, some water quality parameters, that is something that we have observed. And also, we hope that this site is a way that over time, it is possible that in 5 years from now, or by 2025, that we can track that progress to see how things are in fact moving from this baseline. Of course, we're taking on this really major task of assessing the health right across the country by 2017, and that's our first major step. But we do hope that there are ways to see and find reward in meeting that measure of good ecological condition. So the second question around the Red River, so that's a watershed that we have not yet assessed, but is a priority for the coming year. So for the Red Assiniboine, moving into Manitoba, right now you'll see that Manitoba does not have any watersheds assessed. That is a priority for our organization for the next year. And so when you do check back in a year from now, maybe even less than that, and the results of that assessment will be available there. So that's a really important point to note, that this is a living site. New results will come online over the next 2 years as additional watersheds come online for both health and for threat. Okay, the final question related to aquifers and mapping of aquifers. And there are some ways to do that, although it has been pretty limited in terms of application in Canada. I am aware of a couple initiatives using remote sensing products, using reflectance and or on-the-ground measurements to get a sense of aquifer depth. But it can be a quite timely or a time-consuming process. So in some cases, it's the scale of Canada that can be a limitation. Just this vast country that we have, that can be a limitation in terms of monitoring, and that's why we see in some cases our monitoring initiatives don't quite meet that test that would maybe like to see them be in the future.
James, thank you very much for that. I regret to say that we've got all our time for this broadcast today over Google Hangout, so I do have to wrap up and say a few thank yous. First of all, in response, there are a number of questions unanswered. One of them I just want to quickly address. There's been a whole bunch of questions about data. We're using publicly available data. It's listed on the website, and we're analyzing it in a different way, but it's consistent, and our work has made an effort to be consistent across the country, which is what we're really bringing to the table to make sure people can compare their local watershed on a national scale. The other question I wanted to address that Tamara sent in, what should we do given the upcoming election to protect our watersheds? So the first answer is vote. But secondly, get involved. Ask your candidates from whatever party for a real answer on what they're doing about the health and threats to Canada's fresh water, and see which one satisfies you the best, because it's only by raising the issue that the political parties are going to pay attention. I think that's consistent with what Tyler and Alex were speaking about. So first of all, I want to thank our guest, Sarah Weston. Sarah, thank you so much for your ongoing leadership and being here today with us. Tyler and Alex Mifflin, the Water Brothers, you can catch their show on TVO. Thanks so much for your ongoing leadership and entertainment. There's no reason we can't talk about serious issues in a way that engages people. And our own James Snider for the terrific work, ongoing work of WWF-Canada on freshwater issues. So thank you very, very much. I also want to note that we've got a number of donors who've really supported this work, and I want to thank them. If you're interested in the work, go to www.wwf.ca/freshwater, and you can learn more about our work and more about the health assessments at watershedreports.ca. And the final point I'd like to make is we're often asked about what individuals can do for their watersheds. I'd like to take this last moment to highlight James's points and encourage you all to take the following actions. 1, learn more. Learn about what watershed you're in. Learn its health and its threats, and talk to your neighbors and friends and people in your community about the state of fresh water in your community, and get involved with organizations like CURA H2O to address those threats. Secondly, maintain shoreline habitats. You can organize a shoreline cleanup or a fish planning with your colleague, or a fish habitat planning with your colleagues, schools, and groups. And if you visit www.shorelinecleanup.ca, we can help you organize that. And the final thing is volunteer. We have a whole range of Loblaw waterfront projects across Canada. You can volunteer and get engaged and make a very real difference to the health of fresh water in your community. So from all of us at WWF Canada, I want to thank you for your continued support of WWF and for hanging out with us today. I want to thank the producers and team behind the scenes who've done a lot of work to make sure this Google Hangout worked well. Stay tuned for future Google Hangouts and podcasts, and I'm just going to give a little round of applause to our terrific guests today, Tyler and Alex, Sarah, and James. Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody, for being on with us today. Bye-bye.